Earl Simmons had been mopping floors at Ivy Hall for 18 years. Invisible, ignored, erased. But the day a rich white student mocked him with a math riddle on camera, Earl didn't flinch. He solved it in 30 seconds. What happened next didn't just silence the classroom. It exposed a scandal so deep, it could burn the entire school to the ground. But why was a former MIT genius scrubbing floors in the first place? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. At Ivy Hall Preparatory Academy, the air always smelled like polished mahogany, imported espresso, and silent entitlement. The building itself felt like a museum of privilege. Roman columns, gold-accented fixtures, chandeliers that cost more than most houses. Its students were dressed in custom blazers, monogrammed loafers, and the kind of arrogance only generational wealth could breed. Everything about Ivy Hall told you this wasn't just a school, it was a fortress, a gatekeeper to elite futures, where legacy mattered more than merit. Yet between the echoing footsteps of board members' children and the laughter of trust fund teenagers, Earl Simmons moved with quiet purpose. 52, tall and lean. His janitor uniform didn't carry his story, it concealed it. Every morning, before the sun lit the dormitory windows, Earl had already begun his rounds, mopping floors that had never known struggle, scraping gum off chairs under students who would one day run hedge funds, taking out the trash left behind by boys who thought blackness meant servitude. He wasn't bitter, but he wasn't blind either. Earl's routine never changed. He moved through the school like air. Necessary, constant, invisible. No one asked where he came from. No one cared to know his name. Some teachers nodded. Most students didn't look up. And when they did, it was only to ask for a mess to be cleaned. But what no one at Ivy Hall knew, not the dean, not the top-ranked senior, not even the faculty who passed him daily, was that Earl Simmons once held the kind of mind that scared institutions. A gifted mathematician, a former academic star, and a man who had once stood on the verge of genius-level recognition, until it all disappeared. But that part of his life stayed buried, locked inside memories he never volunteered, and pain he'd long ago learned to fold into silence. Ivy Hall wasn't the place for men like Earl to be seen. It was a place where wealth walked tall, and those without it learned to shrink. Every room had invisible lines. Who sat in front, who cleaned after. Earl knew those lines well. He walked them every day with quiet dignity. Students like Austin Merrick never saw those lines. Son of a billionaire tech mogul, Austin was the poster child of Ivy Hall's elite. Blonde hair slicked back with intention. He carried the arrogance of someone raised to believe the world bent around his desires. With a phone always in hand, and a camera-ready smirk, Austin curated every moment of his life like a highlight reel. He wasn't just popular, he was dangerous. Because kids like him didn't just ignore people like Earl, they mocked them, played games with them, turned real lives into content for likes and laughs. Austin's world and Earl's world never overlapped, until the morning of the junior symposium. That day, Earl was cleaning the lecture hall ahead of a student-run competition, where Ivy Hall's most brilliant would showcase their best ideas. It was a room designed for performance. Rows of modern seating, a digital board glowing, and cameras already mounted for live stream. As usual, Earl stayed to the edges, cleaning in silence, as students rehearsed their moments of genius. No one noticed his presence. No one asked if he needed space. But as Earl was adjusting a faulty projector cable, something he was often called on to fix because the IT department couldn't be bothered, Austin walked in with a group of students. He noticed Earl crouched by the console, sleeves rolled up, eyes focused, and in that moment, something mean lit up behind Austin's grin. Maybe it was the presence of his friends. Maybe it was boredom, or maybe it was just the kind of cruelty that grew when unchecked. He strutted to the whiteboard, uncapped a marker, and with a loud screech, began writing a problem across the board. A long, complex logic riddle, dripping with variables and equations. One that looked impressive enough to confuse even the best of the school students. Then Austin turned, voice just loud enough to carry across the room. "Hey," he called, with mock curiosity. "Bet you can't solve this." He smiled wider. "You know, since you're always around the tech stuff." The room chuckled. A few students looked up from their laptops, amused. Earl looked over his shoulder. He knew what this was. He'd seen this game before, played in boardrooms, classrooms, and street corners. He rose slowly, eyes steady, but his face calm. Austin's phone was already pointed at him. No pressure, he added, recording. Just a bit of fun. Let's see what the janitor's got. Laughter rolled across the room, casual and cruel. It echoed off the walls, bounced off Earl's ears, and still Earl said nothing. He stepped toward the board, picked up the marker Austin had dropped with flair, and began to write. His hand didn't tremble. His strokes were deliberate, practiced, not the frantic guessing of someone trying to prove himself, but the quiet confidence of a man returning to a language he never forgot. One by one, variables became constants, lines of logic unfurled like music across the board. The room grew still. Even Austin stopped filming, confused. Earl finished in under a minute, capped the marker, and walked away, not to explain, not to boast, just to finish fixing the projector like nothing had happened. Silence settled like dust. The problem had been solved. Perfectly. Every student in the room stared, not at the board, but at the man who had just dismantled every assumption they held about him. A few reached for their phones, whispering. A girl in the front row opened her laptop and typed the solution into a calculator. Confirmed. The math was real. The logic was airtight. Austin blinked. The camera in his hand was still recording, but the grin on his face had died. He had planned a public humiliation, but instead he'd filmed a revelation. The video would be online within hours. And Earl Simmons, the invisible janitor, was about to become a name everyone knew. But one rich kid, Austin Merrick, was about to mistake silence for stupidity and make a move that would ignite the entire school. The lecture hall at Ivy Hall Prep was electric with the hum of entitlement. Rows of pristine desks reflected the early morning light, pouring in from vaulted windows. Beneath them, students lounged like royalty in training, scrolling their phones, adjusting cufflinks, and complaining about the quality of the cappuccino in the student lounge. In the far right corner, near the AV rack, Earl Simmons crouched beside a tangled nest of cables. His fingers moved with quiet precision as he tried to reset the HDMI input on the main screen. The same way he had a dozen times before. Same projector, different day, same invisibility. No one thanked Earl. No one offered help. To them, he was just the janitor. Background noise in a polished world of future CEOs, senators, and Ivy League legacies. But to Austin Merrick, this was a stage. Austin was late that morning, as usual, but he arrived with flair. The door swung open dramatically, and heads turned. He strolled in, sunglasses still on, even indoors, flanked by his two closest friends, Dorian and Clay, both of whom were rich enough to think gravity bent slightly in their favor. Austin had more than just money. He had inherited a sense of superiority so unshakable that even his teachers hesitated before correcting him. His father was one of the most powerful tech CEOs in the country, and his mother sat on the Ivy Hall board. Rules bent for Austin. People bowed. He strutted past the front row, flipping his perfectly coiffed blonde hair as he surveyed the room like it was a stage set for his amusement. That's when his eyes fell on Earl, alone, focused, squinting at a faulty cable with one knee on the floor. A grin began to curl on Austin's face. Not the friendly kind, the kind that knew an audience was watching. "Yo," he said loudly, making sure his voice carried. "What's he doing in here? Is there a spill or something?" A few students chuckled, unsure whether to laugh or wait. Austin didn't give them time to decide. He was already walking toward the whiteboard, pulling a sleek black marker from his designer backpack. "Let's see if we can level up the entertainment in here." Earl remained kneeling, saying nothing. Austin uncapped the marker and began scrawling something across the board. His handwriting was oddly meticulous, his posture theatrical. The math problem he wrote wasn't elementary. It was a deliberately convoluted logic riddle, with layered variables, multiple steps, and a trap or two, the kind of question that looked genius level at a glance, but was designed to confuse. He had copied it the night before from a Stanford entry exam. It wasn't him. But plagiarism didn't matter when you were white, rich, and smug enough to assume no one would question you. By the time he capped the marker and turned back to face the room, a small crowd had started watching. A few students leaned forward, curious. Dorian began recording. Clay nudged another student, whispering, "Watch this. It's about to be gold." Austin stretched his arms and addressed the room like a game show host. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with faux gravity, "today we present the Ivy Hall Intelligence Challenge." Dorian panned his phone camera toward Earl. "Starring our very own maintenance man," Austin continued, voice dripping with sarcasm. Now I know he usually deals with broken wires and sticky floors, but today let's see if he can solve a real problem. He turned toward Earl, smiling like a man who believed himself untouchable. Bet you can't solve this, janitor. Laughter erupted, hesitant at first, then louder. Not everyone laughed, but no one stopped him either. That was the true disease of places like Ivy Hall. Cruelty disguised as humor, masked by legacy, and protected by silence. Earl rose slowly, placing the HDMI cord back onto the AV cart, without a word. He didn't glare, didn't protest. He didn't flinch at the word janitor, though its weaponization carried centuries of weight. He simply turned toward the board, his dark eyes scanning the riddle Austin had written. "Con, take a shot," Austin said, nudging Clay. "Might win a bonus." A few students laughed again, but this time, it sounded a little nervous. Earl moved toward the whiteboard. With the entire lecture hall watching, he took the marker Austin had tossed onto the podium and began to write. At first it was quiet, then shock began to ripple through the room. Earl's hand moved with speed, yet with such fluid accuracy that even students in the back row leaned forward. He wasn't hesitating. He was dissecting the riddle as though he'd seen it before, solving each layer with mathematical elegance. One equation led cleanly into the next, symbols folded into logic chains. False paths were instantly bypassed. It wasn't just that he was solving it, it was how easily he moved through the complexity, like he was dancing, like this language was one he never forgot. "Yo," Clay whispered, nudging Dorian. "He's actually doing it?" Dorian didn't respond. He was still filming. Austin's face, once smug, had tightened. His lips were parted slightly, confusion setting in. The riddle was supposed to confuse, to trap. It had taken Austin 20 minutes just to memorize the answer last night, and Earl, the janitor, was solving it in real time, in front of everyone, with no pause. Earl reached the final line, drew a box around the answer, turned, calmly placed the marker back on the tray, and walked to his mop bucket without a single word. Silent. Not polite silence. Not stunned silence. Hollow silence. Every student in the room just watched him return to his cart, put on gloves, and begin wiping down the side table next to the podium, as though he hadn't just dismantled their understanding of who he was. The girl in the front row typed furiously on her laptop. The boy beside her had already Googled the problem and confirmed the solution. It was correct, and not just correct. Efficient, elegant, genius level. Austin's mouth opened to say something, but no words came out. He was still holding his phone, the video still recording. The plan had been to post the clip for laughs, mock the janitor, build a trending joke, maybe even pitch it to his campus comedy TikTok channel. But this wasn't funny anymore. He had just been humiliated, and Earl hadn't even spoken. That was the part that cut deeper than the math. Still filming, Austin lowered the phone, quickly hitting save before sliding it into his pocket. His cheeks burned. People were still watching him now, but not the way they usually did. No admiration, no approval, just thinly veiled amusement, and something else that truly terrified him. Respect, not for him, for the janitor. And as Earl pushed his mop bucket out of the hall, back straight, posture unbothered, a student in the corner whispered something that would later be repeated 1,000 times online. "Yo, I think we just watched a genius in work boots." Within minutes, the video was on 4 student group chats, 2 Discord servers, and TikTok. The caption varied: "Janitor outsmarts rich kid. You won't believe who solved this. Proof money ain't everything." But the effect was the same. The internet, like truth, has a way of cutting through hierarchy. And by sunset, Earl Simmons wasn't invisible anymore. Earl didn't flinch. He picked up the chalk with hands that once solved algorithms in Ivy League halls, and changed everything. Earl Simmons stood at the whiteboard in the lecture hall of Ivy Hall Preparatory Academy, his janitor's sleeve rolled up to expose a forearm that bore faint scars of years spent wielding mop handles rather than mathematics. He had just been challenged by Austin Merrick, the richest, most visible student in the school, who had scrawled a complex logic riddle across the board, laughing behind his phone as students recorded. Now the marker lay in Earl's hand. The room pulsated with expectation. Austin's camera phone hovered, expecting humiliation, expecting confusion. The teacher at the back leaned forward, eyebrows raised, unaccustomed to this turn of events. A student whispered to another, "Is he really going to do it?" Earl did not reply. He did not glance at the recording devices, or the audience of curious, amused seniors. Instead, he took a steady breath and began. His writing was deliberate. Each letter, each symbol, each equation grew with precision. The chalk squeaked softly in the silence. The complex riddle that Austin had posed, one designed to stump Ivy Hall's best students, seemed to unravel at Earl's fingertips. What had been written to provoke now folded into logic under the janitor's chalk. The students held their phones still. A silent wave of shock rolled through the hall. "Why are you doing this?" Austin's voice cracked through the silence, recording still active. His mockery had been sincere a moment ago. Now it sounded off-kilter. "Aren't you just the janitor?" he asked, urgency creeping in. "You don't belong up here." Earl paused mid-symbol. He didn't reply. His face remained calm as the sea before a storm. With a gentle motion, he finished the final step, drew the line under the answer, stepped back, and put the marker down. Then he gathered his cleaning bucket and mop, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Stillness reigned. The teacher, mouth open, cleared his throat. One of the students ventured forward, peering at the board. Another tapped their phone, then froze. The answer matched Earl's writing. The derivation was correct. The logic chain intact. A quiet murmur began, like wind rising in a valley. Austin lowered his phone. His hand trembled slightly. For a moment, he looked at Earl, not with pride, not with triumph, but with something like disbelief. The buzzing started almost instantly. In the front row, a girl whispered, "I'm uploading this." Another student opened a Discord on their laptop, typed faster than they thought possible. "Janitor solves senior riddle in under a minute." The teacher shook his head, walked away as if to regain composure. Earl simply returned to the mop. He cleaned the floor near the board, stepping around the equations he had just written, as though he were sweeping away something that should have never been written there. In the hall beyond, phones were already lighting up. Clips were sent. Screenshots captured the board. Comments poured in. Who knew the janitor was a math wizard? Ivy Hall just got exposed. Does he have a PhD we didn't know about? The students at the center of the streamed moment felt the ground shift beneath them. For Austin, the joke had become a revelation, and his audience of followers was switching from laughter to stunned admiration, and then to something more dangerous: curiosity. Earl stopped mopping, set the bucket aside, and pulled on a pair of rubber gloves he kept tucked near the storage closet. As he rinsed the mop head, he watched from the corner of his eye the students filing out, still talking, still sharing. He felt their stares. He felt the change, but he didn't lift his head. He didn't say, "Look at me." He didn't want that. He simply did his job and carried the new weight silently. For Austin, the moment shattered years of assumption. All his cameras, all his audience, all his inherited swagger, none of it prepared him for being eclipsed mid-joke by someone he meant to humiliate. He had planned the spectacle. He had promised the humiliation. Instead, the audience changed gear. They downloaded the clip, shared it, on Reddit. It appeared in our elite prep humiliation. On Twitter it was retweeted with the caption, "Janitor shuts down tyranny of privilege in high school riddle challenge." Within minutes, it was trending. It should have been over. The halls should have cleared. The day ended. The mop bucket reeled away, but instead the ripples expanded. Teachers glanced at the board. The senior class president walked up to Austin and whispered something. Austin's phone was still recording, but now he was reading messages. One came through. "Your clip is everywhere. Want to comment?" He looked at Earl, who had washed out the mop and leaned against a column. Earl watched the reaction streaming across the phone screens of students, but his expression remained unreadable. Something shifted. An unexpected twist. The math teacher who had paused at the board stepped forward and dropped his clipboard. "Mr. Simmons," he said quietly, "I'd like to talk with you in private after school." Earl's hand froze just above the bucket rim. The teacher rarely addressed him. When he did, it was to ask him to clear a spill. Not this. "Right after class," the teacher added. "It's important." Earl didn't respond. The teacher walked away. The students followed, still whispering. One student opened their phone and muttered, "He's gone viral." By evening, Earl's face would be on every major social media platform, every school blog, every news feed. Austin's cruel game, calculated, rehearsed broadcast, had backfired spectacularly. The audience had shifted. The roles had flipped, and the rich kid who expected the punchline found himself the punchline. As Earl exited the building, his mop bucket rolling quietly behind him, he passed a line of students waiting to leave. They looked at him differently now. Some nodded. One student called his name quietly. Mr. Simmons, she said. When did you learn that? He shrugged lightly, offering a half smile. A long time ago, he answered softly. The student didn't press further. She didn't need to. Something had changed between them. Outside, the evening sky hung pale over the campus. Austin stood at the entrance, phone in hand, flicking through the endless reposts of his moment of failure. His father's voice echoed in his mind. His legacy felt unstable. The jeers he had once delivered now seemed hollow. And beneath the surface of the student body, something else was stirring. The board of Ivy Hall would soon convene. The donors would notice. The faculty would whisper. Privilege was uneasy. When exposed, Earl could sense that the mop handle in his hand might no longer represent invisibility. It might become a symbol of something more. He wheeled his bucket to the janitorial closet. The door shut behind him. He paused, hands on the bucket handle. His mind turned to the years lost, to the degrees unclaimed, to the nights in dorm rooms he never occupied, to the silence he carried for so long. Just then his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at it. An unfamiliar number. The screen read, MIT Alumni Office. His breath caught. He opened the message. It said only, let's talk. We've been looking for you. Earl's heart skipped. In that moment, nothing about Ivy Hall would ever be the same, and neither would Earl Simmons. By evening, Earl's face had gone viral, and Austin's cruel game had backfired in front of millions. By the next morning, Ivy Hall Preparatory Academy was no longer just an elite campus tucked away in suburban Connecticut. It was a trending topic. The video of Earl Simmons solving the complex riddle had erupted online like a cultural earthquake. Within hours, the comment sections turned into battlegrounds. Twitter threads spiraled into debates, and TikTok was flooded with remixes, breakdowns, and reaction videos. Everyone had a take. But the internet had already chosen its hero. Hashtags like Janitor Genius, Earl Simmons deserves more, and This is America's Shame began trending. A clip titled Rich Kid Gets Schooled by Janitor hit 2 million views by dawn. But it wasn't just the video that had people talking. It was the silence Earl carried. He didn't argue, didn't retaliate. He had let the solution speak, and the world listened. On Reddit, users began digging. One thread exploded in aura justice served, where someone posted a screenshot from an old MIT graduation booklet. The name Earl D. Simmons was highlighted. The thread's title was simple, Wait, is this him? Users cross-referenced a blurry ID photo with the now viral video. The facial structure matched. The timeline fit, and then someone uncovered a decades-old MIT student newspaper article mentioning a scandal, an academic expulsion due to an unresolved plagiarism accusation. That was the ignition point. TikTok creators went into full investigation mode. Why did a math prodigy vanish from MIT in the 90s and reappear as a janitor? One viral video asked. Another creator sobbed into the camera, We've built a system that buries black brilliance because it doesn't fit the narrative. Morning talk shows picked it up. Is the smartest janitor in America working at a prep school that failed to recognize him? Asked one anchor. Late-night hosts turned the story into monologues. Memes flooded the feeds. But beneath the viral wave was something darker. A growing national sense that this wasn't just a feel-good underdog story. It was an indictment. Within 48 hours, journalists reached out. News vans parked outside Ivy Hall's iron gates. The school's phone lines lit up. Former alumni sent emails demanding clarification. But behind the scenes, panic had taken root. At the center of the storm sat Headmaster Charles Wexler, a man who had built his career on polishing the school's legacy, not protecting the unseen. He watched the story unravel across his screens, his jaw tightening with each headline. It was the first time in his 22-year tenure that he couldn't control the narrative. In a private conference room, he met with 2 board members and a representative from the Merrick family's legal team. Austin's father, Bradford Merrick, had already sent word from Silicon Valley. This story was not good for business. We need to contain this, one board member whispered, staring at a tablet screen. They're calling us a plantation in blazers. Wexler nodded slowly. Damage control, he said. Start with the source. An assistant entered with a notepad. Mr. Simmons is on his lunch break. Should I call him in? Do it, Wexler replied. Quietly. Across campus, Earl stood in the dim light of the supply closet. His lunch, a homemade sandwich and apple slices, sat untouched beside him. He was reading a printed email. It had no sender, just a subject line: "I remember what they did to you. I have the records." He'd received it anonymously the night before, from an encrypted source. The attached documents included transcripts, meeting notes, and internal MIT memos. One in particular made his hands tremble. "If this becomes public, our credibility is at risk. Redirect and terminate enrollment immediately." Internal note from MIT faculty committee. He folded the papers, slipped them into an envelope, and tucked it inside his jacket, just as the assistant entered. "Mr. Simmons? The headmaster would like to speak with you." Earl didn't flinch. He nodded, picked up his lunch, and followed her through the corridors that had grown quieter over the past 48 hours. No one whispered insults anymore. In fact, no one spoke to him at all. Students lowered their eyes. Teachers avoided his gaze. The ones who once waved or asked for projector help now crossed the hall before reaching him. Even the other janitorial staff kept their distance, not out of disrespect, out of fear. He entered the headmaster's office. Wexler stood behind his desk, his expression polite but hollow.
"Mr. Simmons, thank you for coming," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Please sit."
Earl remained standing. Wexler's smile thinned. "We've received some attention. The video. The hashtags. It's creating disruption." Earl folded his arms, saying nothing. Wexler continued. "I want to be very clear. We appreciate your hard work, but we are an academic institution with a reputation. The media frenzy is affecting our donors, our admissions calls, and, frankly, our ability to operate smoothly." "Smoothly?" Earl asked, his voice low, measured. "Or quietly?" Wexler hesitated. "Let's not politicize this." "It's already political," Earl replied. "I was invisible to this place until I wasn't. Now I'm inconvenient." The room went still. The headmaster leaned forward. "We'd like you to take a short leave, with pay. Let things settle. No interviews, no press, just time to reflect." Earl's eyes narrowed. "So you want me to disappear again?" No, Wexler said, hands raised. "Just recalibrate." Earl stood silent for a long moment. Then he pulled out the envelope and placed it on Wexler's desk. Wexler frowned. "What's this?" "Truth," Earl said. "Something I've had buried for 30 years. The headmaster didn't reach for it." Earl turned and walked out. As he left, he passed Austin in the hallway. The boy looked different, smaller somehow, shoulders hunched, eyes rimmed red. Their eyes met for a moment. Austin opened his mouth to speak, but Earl didn't stop. Back in the janitor's closet, Earl opened his locker. Inside, taped to the door, was a faded photo of him at age 21, in a lab coat, grinning, standing beneath the MIT logo. He stared at it now, not with longing, but with clarity. Across campus, the media vans multiplied. Parents started arriving for emergency board meetings. And upstairs, Headmaster Wexler stared at the envelope, sweating. As media vans lined the campus, Earl was summoned to the headmaster's office and told to stay silent. The door clicked softly behind Earl as he left Headmaster Wexler's office, but the air around him felt louder than it ever had before. The hallway, usually filled with the noise of polished shoes and distant laughter, was deathly still. It wasn't silence. It was surveillance. Every pair of eyes he passed flickered with something different now. Not curiosity, not respect, fear, awareness. He had crossed a line, not because he solved a riddle, but because he broke an illusion. The illusion that brilliance wore blazers, that wisdom came with whiteness, that intellect belonged only to the privileged, and those who cleaned their desks were not meant to challenge them. The next morning, Earl found a cream-colored envelope tucked under the mop bucket in the storage room, not sealed with an official school letterhead, but hand-delivered and signed by Wexler himself. Inside was a check. The amount was substantial, far more than a janitor's annual salary, and attached was a short note, typed without warmth. "We understand your desire to maintain dignity, but it is in everyone's best interest that the current media attention subsides. Please refrain from engaging with reporters, students, or social platforms. We ask that you consider this a gesture of respect and privacy." Earl read it twice. Then he flipped the check over, signed the back, wrote "Return to Sender" across the middle, and slid it back under the headmaster's office door. By lunchtime, the air was colder. Teachers who once nodded at him kept their eyes fixed on the ground. One even turned abruptly in the hallway when she saw him coming. Students whispered in corners. Earl didn't need to hear the words. He could read the shift in posture. the fear in their expressions. Later that evening, Earl returned to the janitor's locker room. The corridors were empty. The door creaked as he opened it. Inside, a heavy silence clung to the steel walls. Then he saw it. Scratched into the metal of his locker door, carved deep with what looked like a box cutter, were 4 words: "Stay in your place." Earl didn't move for a long time. The sentence wasn't just a threat. It was a history. It echoed everything America had tried to tell men like him for generations. It wasn't about his job title. It was about the presumption that someone like him didn't belong in brilliance. That being black and brilliant was a violation, a threat, a challenge to the order they wanted to protect. His hands trembled, but he didn't cry. He hadn't in years. He pulled a rag from his cleaning cart, soaked it in bleach, and scrubbed, not because he thought the words would vanish, but because he refused to let them sit untouched. He scrubbed until the steel turned raw, and still, the etching remained. Word of the check, of the scratched locker, didn't come from Earl. He told no one. But the janitorial staff wasn't blind. One of them, a young black man named Richie, saw the marks later that night and took a photo. By morning, that image was on Twitter. The caption was simple: "This is what they do when a black man dares to be more than a mop." It ignited something new. People began asking real questions. Why hadn't Earl ever been acknowledged for his intellect before? Why hadn't Ivy Hall issued a statement? Why were they suddenly silent after years of parading diversity on their brochures? News anchors shifted tone. The story was no longer heartwarming. It was investigative. Yet behind closed doors, Ivy Hall circled the wagons. A secret faculty meeting was called. Phones were collected at the door. A PowerPoint presentation was shown. Reputation management and narrative strategy. The goal: control the damage without implicating anyone. They discussed framing Earl's moment as an isolated incident, emphasizing that the school had always valued all staff and was committed to uplifting voices from every role. But the numbers told a different story. 87% of Ivy Hall's service workers were black or Latino. 0 had ever been featured in the school's annual report. None had ever spoken at student assembly. Wexler's voice grew stern during the meeting. "The real threat here," he said, "is not the janitor's intellect. It's the shift in power. Once people believe this institution can be questioned from the bottom, we lose control."
No one objected.
Not allowed. Meanwhile, in the storage room, Earl received another envelope. This one had no money. Just a photo. A blurry black and white image of a young Earl, mid-sentence, from decades ago. Behind him, an MIT chalkboard filled with equations. Beneath the photo, one line typed on a strip of paper: "You were never supposed to come back." He stared at it, a cold knot forming in his gut. That night, Earl sat in his modest apartment surrounded by silence and ghosts. He stared at the envelope, the scratched locker, the refused check. He opened his laptop, something he rarely used anymore, and began digging into his own past. The articles, the transcripts, the accusations, everything came rushing back. In 1993, he had been a rising star at MIT, published by 19, teaching assistant by 20. But then, just months before his final thesis, an anonymous plagiarism claim was filed against him. His professors turned cold. His access was revoked. No one defended him, and he never learned who filed the claim. Until now. Because buried in the file Wexler hadn't opened, the one Earl left on his desk, was a name: Dr. Benjamin Moffat, a tenured white professor, with a reputation for brilliance, and a history of silencing students who threatened to outshine him. He had accused Earl of lifting a proof from a private research draft, yet no such draft had ever been produced. Earl realized something else that night. Moffat's son, Russell, had attended Ivy Hall 10 years earlier, and Moffat himself had donated to the school's new science wing, the one with his name on the plaque. The circle closed. Ivy Hall wasn't just protecting its students, it was protecting its own architects of suppression. But Earl wasn't the same boy they'd broken in the 90s. He was older now, angrier, smarter, and this time, he had proof. In a hidden flash drive he kept buried behind a false panel in his kitchen wall, Earl retrieved his original thesis, time-stamped, dated, and encrypted, the same paper that had mysteriously vanished from MIT's archives. Alongside it were old email exchanges between him and Dr. Moffat, one in which Moffat admitted, "Your math frightens people who think their titles make them untouchable." That line had haunted Earl for years, but now it would haunt them. At school the next day, Austin walked the hall alone. His father had called the night before, not to check on him, but to scold him. "You brought this to our door," Bradford Merrick had said coldly. "You humiliated this family." Austin didn't sleep that night. For the first time he saw the power his name held, and how easily it turned to poison. At lunch he passed Earl in the faculty hallway. Austin slowed. "Mr. Simmons," he said quietly. "I didn't mean for this to become this." Earl turned calm. "You meant exactly what you did," he said softly. "You just didn't expect it to cost you anything." Austin looked down. But before he could speak again, Earl walked away, not with anger, but with certainty. A quiet certainty that he wasn't alone anymore. The world had seen him, and the people trying to erase him were running out of time. But Earl's past was about to resurface, and with it the truth about why he'd disappeared from academia. Earl Simmons had only known how to excel from the time he was 7 years old, and solved advanced algebra before most kids learned multiplication, to winning national math Olympiads with hand-me-down notebooks and stubby pencils. Genius wasn't something he chased. It was something that chased him. By 19, he was a sophomore at MIT, years ahead of his peers. Professors used his exam solutions as teaching material. Grad students asked him to peer review their papers. One even jokingly offered to swap thesis credits. But Earl never laughed too hard. Even then, he understood what it meant to be a black genius in white spaces. Brilliant but inconvenient, impressive yet threatening. By 20 he had published 2 solo research papers on neural quantum logic, a field still in its infancy. His work proposed a framework to accelerate quantum decision processing using a modified Bell-state neural grid. Ideas so novel they earned him attention far beyond campus. Stanford reached out. IBM offered a summer lab rotation. A TED Talk invitation came through a New York rep. And deep in the corridors of MIT, Earl's name was spoken with cautious awe. But not everyone was impressed. One professor in particular, Dr. Benjamin Moffat, saw something else in Earl's success. A threat. Moffat was respected, powerful, and undeniably brilliant. He had tenure, decades of research, and a seat on the thesis approval committee. But what he lacked, what Earl had in abundance, was originality. Earl's methods exposed a fault line in one of Moffat's published theories. During a seminar, Earl gently questioned a statistical assumption in Moffat's latest work. It wasn't confrontation, it was academic inquiry. Still, Moffat's face darkened, and the applause that followed Earl's point was the final insult. From that moment, the air around Earl began to change. He noticed it in the smallest ways: research requests that stopped being answered, professors who stopped inviting him to office hours, a missed fellowship interview, a grant that never cleared. The warmth drained slowly, replaced by cold procedural distance. Then came the accusation. 2 months before his final thesis defense, Earl was summoned to the Dean of Academic Integrity. The office smelled of old paper and suspicion. A letter sat on the desk, unsigned. It accused Earl of plagiarizing a proof from a senior faculty member's draft research. No name was listed, no document attached, just the accusation, vague, broad, and devastating. Earl was stunned. "I have all my work documented," he said. "I can show you." "We're not discussing evidence yet," the dean interrupted. His tone clipped. "There will be an investigation. Then let me confront the accuser." That's not how this process works. The following weeks were a blur. Earl provided everything: timestamps, notebooks, email chains, even the original code samples dated months prior to the alleged offense. But no matter what he gave, the system moved like concrete, slow, opaque, and weighted. Then came the worst blow. His thesis defense was suspended. Not delayed. Suspended indefinitely. Without it he wouldn't graduate. His advisor, a kind-eyed mathematician named Dr. Holly Bray, tried to help. She met with the board. She offered to vouch for the originality of Earl's work. But behind closed doors, even she was told to stand down. "This is bigger than just Earl," she whispered during their final meeting. "There's pressure from higher up." That same night, Earl returned to his dorm and found the door open. Nothing stolen, just rearranged. His research binders had been flipped through. A thumb drive was missing. His roommate claimed he saw nothing. The next morning, Earl received an email. "Due to unresolved allegations and procedural concerns, your enrollment is hereby terminated, effective immediately. Further action will be considered upon administrative review." Just like that, he was gone. No hearing, no chance to defend himself. 1 month later, a white student published a paper that bore striking resemblance to Earl's early work. with a co-author, Dr. Benjamin Moffat. Earl tried everything. He reached out to student advocates, filed complaints, contacted civil rights groups. But MIT was a fortress, and he was alone. No lawyer would take the case. No one wanted to go up against an institution with billion-dollar endowments. His scholarships vanished. So did the job offers. So did the apartment. Within 6 weeks, he was homeless in Boston. Within 3 months, he was working in a warehouse outside Hartford, lifting crates for a temp agency that didn't ask about degrees. He never told his mother what happened. She thought he had chosen to take a break from academia. He let her believe that. It was easier than explaining the weight of betrayal. For years, he drifted, construction sites, moving companies, repair gigs. Then came a night job at a community college, cleaning classrooms. Then Ivy Hall, steady hours, decent pay, insurance, and silence. He buried the past because no one believed it anyway. People didn't want to hear that a black kid at MIT had been robbed of his future. They wanted feel-good stories, not ones that revealed rot beneath the marble. So he hid, until a spoiled teenager, with a phone, turned him into a trending headline. Now the past wasn't hiding anymore. It was hunting. That morning, as Earl walked across campus, an unfamiliar car sat idling across the street. Black sedan, tinted windows, no school sticker. He noticed it again near the east courtyard, then again parked near the admin wing. At first he ignored it, until a package arrived at his door. No return label. Inside, a faded copy of his original thesis, and a note. I kept this. I've always known the truth, but I couldn't speak back then. I can now. H.B. Dr. Holly Bray, his old advisor, still at MIT, still watching, still carrying the guilt. He held the thesis in shaking hands. The paper that had once opened doors, now returned like a ghost. He flipped through the pages. Some had her annotations in the margins. Questions, praise, even a circled proof with the word elegant, scribbled beside it. He pressed the document to his chest and sat down slowly. For 30 years he had lived, like a man, erased. Now he was being written back in. But he wasn't the only one watching. In a dimly lit office near MIT's historic campus, Dr. Benjamin Moffat sat in a leather chair, staring at his screen. His silver hair was perfectly parted. His office untouched by time, his name etched in stone outside the math building. On the monitor in front of him, the viral video. Earl. Solving the problem. Confident. Calm. Unshaken. Moffat's jaw tightened. Next to his keyboard was an old printed email, the one Earl had written him in 1993, pleading for a meeting to discuss the accusation. Moffat never responded, but he never deleted it either. Now he read it again, for the 100th time. Then he opened a secure browser and typed in a private research database. Author Simmons, Earl D. Search returned. 0 results. Moffat leaned back. If Earl came forward, everything might resurface. The theft, the cover-up, the lies. And this time, people were listening. His empire of credibility had stood for decades, but all it would take was one voice, backed by receipts, to send it crashing. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then, slowly, he began composing an email to ivyhall.mmed.schoolnet. Subject: concerning staff member Simmons. But now, as his name resurfaced, someone from MIT's dark past was watching and panicking. It arrived at 3:13. The subject line was blank, no sender name, just a string of random numbers in the address, 991xf, protonmail.com. Earl wouldn't have opened it under normal circumstances. Most late-night emails were spam or hate mail ever since the video went viral. But this one was different. There was no greeting, no introduction. Just a single sentence at the top of the message. I was there when they destroyed you. I have proof. Earl sat up straighter in bed. The glow from the laptop screen reflected in his eyes, casting shadows on his worn, tired face. He scrolled down. Attached was a PDF file titled Confidential Memo 9. His fingers hovered over the trackpad. A sharp exhale escaped his lips as he clicked. What unfolded on the screen stopped his breath. It was an internal memorandum, dated February 4, 1993. It bore the MIT Department of Mathematics letterhead. The memo was addressed from a then senior faculty member to a small group of department heads. The contents were damning. The allegations against Mr. Simmons will proceed regardless of independent verification. While some discrepancies have arisen in timeline and authorship, the larger concern remains reputational. We cannot afford a public scandal, particularly one involving a racially charged accusation during a sensitive admission cycle, expedite termination and seal relevant documents under institutional privilege. The department's integrity must be preserved above all else. It was signed with initials, B.M., Benjamin Moffat. Earl froze. His heart pounded in his chest like a war drum. There it was. Everything he'd suspected, now in writing. They had framed him not because of what he did, but because of what he represented. A brilliant black scholar, who threatened the sanctity of white academic hierarchy. And the memo proved one more thing. It had never been about plagiarism. It had always been about preservation, of image, of control, of a lie they built their careers on. Earl sat in the dark, shoulders heavy with 30 years of silence. His apartment was so quiet, he could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sound of a passing car. But inside his chest, there was a rising storm, rage, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that grinds, slow, seismic, unstoppable. He stared at the screen for a long time. Then, without hesitation, he replied to the anonymous sender. "Who are you?"
No answer.
Not that night, not the next morning, just silence. But Earl didn't need more. He already had enough to detonate the foundation of 2 elite institutions. MIT had erased him. Ivy Hall had mocked him. And the Merrick family. They had used his silence as a backdrop for their son's redemption arc, carefully spinning a new narrative, in interviews, one where Austin had learned a valuable lesson about humility, without once acknowledging the racism that triggered it. They thought this would pass. They were wrong. He closed the email and opened a new tab. Typed freelance investigative journalists. Brooklyn, New York. Most of the top results were big names. Corporate-backed, polished. He kept scrolling. Then he found her. Layla Brooks. Young, loud, unapologetically political. She ran a scrappy blog called Dig Up, known for breaking stories too messy for mainstream outlets. She had exposed a corrupt housing policy in Crown Heights and dismantled a gentrification scheme involving the city council. No PR filters, no institutional loyalties, and most importantly, she was hungry. Earl clicked her contact link. There was a simple form. He skipped it. He went straight to her email. To Layla at digupmedia. Subject: confidential tip. Academic sabotage. Body: my name is Earl Simmons. I was expelled from MIT in 1993, under fabricated allegations. I have proof. You're the only one I trust to tell it right. He attached the memo. Then he hit send. For a long time after that, he sat still, listening to the silence grow thicker. A strange calm settled over him. Not peace, but purpose. And then, just as he started to close the laptop, it pinged. New email. From Layla at Dig Up Media. Subject: on my way. 3 words. That was all. At that exact moment, across the country, in a wood-paneled conference room at MIT, a very different meeting was underway. Benjamin Moffat, now a semi-retired professor emeritus, sat across from 2 younger faculty members and a legal advisor. The room smelled of coffee and drink. "I told you we should have buried it deeper," Moffat muttered, glaring at the monitor showing the leaked memo. "This never should have surfaced. It's spreading fast," the younger professor said. "Reddit, Twitter, even journalists are picking it up." "They don't know if it's real yet," the lawyer interrupted. "But if the original author comes forward..." Moffat's jaw clenched. "He won't," he snapped. "He's a janitor. He's got no platform, no resources." The lawyer shifted uneasily. "He has the truth." Moffat turned cold. "Then we make sure no one listens." Back in Hartford, Earl waited. 6 hours later, Layla arrived at a modest diner, not far from his apartment. She wore a navy hoodie, ripped jeans, and black boots. No makeup, no filters. She looked like she hadn't slept in 2 days. Earl respected that. They sat in a booth by the window. He slid the folder across the table. She opened it, reading in silence, eyes growing wide. "Holy. It's all there," Earl said, voice low. "Have you gone to anyone else?" "No one would touch it." She tapped the memo. This is career-ending. For them. You realize that, right?" Earl looked out the window. "I didn't lose a career," he said. "They took my life." Layla sat back, nodding slowly. Then she pulled out a voice recorder and a notebook. "We're going to blow this open, and not just MIT. I want the full story. Ivy Hall, Merrick, all of it." Earl nodded once. It's time. What followed was a 3-hour conversation that peeled back decades of betrayal, fear, and quiet genius. Layla asked precise questions, taking notes furiously. She didn't flinch when he showed her photos of the vandalized locker. She didn't try to sensationalize his pain. She listened. That night, as Layla boarded her train back to Brooklyn, she texted Earl one final message. This story is going to change everything. He stared at the screen, and for the first time in 30 years, Earl Simmons allowed himself to believe it might be true. Earl sent one email to a hungry young journalist from Brooklyn who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. The video opened with no music, no dramatic visuals, just a quiet shot of Earl Simmons sitting in a plain chair in front of a blank backdrop, looking directly into the camera. His hands were folded in his lap. His eyes, calm and steady, told a truth deeper than anything written on paper. My name is Earl Simmons, he said. I was expelled from MIT in 1993. Not because I cheated, not because I broke the rules, but because I challenged the ones who made them. That sentence alone was enough to send the internet into a frenzy. The video released on Layla Brooks's independent platform DigUp and cross-posted to YouTube and Twitter, clocked in at 32 minutes. It wasn't a traditional expose. It was a slow burn. Thoughtful, clean, raw. No filters, no sympathy music. Just Earl, speaking the truth with the weight of history in every word. He recounted everything, from being a teenage prodigy raised by a single mother in South Carolina, to solving advanced theories before he could legally drink. He described how his brilliance lit rooms until it began to threaten people who had never been questioned, how his quiet correction of a senior professor's error led to whispers, then silence, then erasure. He described a letter from MIT, the sudden expulsion, the absence of a hearing, the missing thesis, the smear, the fear, the isolation, then the years of silence. Layla's voice was heard only occasionally, asking the kind of questions no mainstream journalist ever dared. Do you think your race was the reason you were erased? Earl had looked at the lens, unwavering. I don't think. I know. Then came the turning point. Layla narrated the story's climax over a collage of documents. The internal MIT memo, the time-stamped thesis, the vandalized locker at Ivy Hall, and finally, the viral video that started it all. Austin Merrick's smug voice challenging the janitor, followed by Earl's quiet exacting solution. The final line of the expose. This wasn't just about a math problem. It was about who America allows to be brilliant. The internet detonated. 10 million views in the first 24 hours. By the second day, the hashtag Injustice for Earl trended across all platforms. Celebrities tweeted support. College professors reposted the video as mandatory viewing. A university in Chicago offered Earl an honorary doctorate within 48 hours of the interview's release. Students across the country held walkouts and teach-ins, demanding deeper reforms in academic institutions. But nowhere was the reaction more explosive than at Ivy Hall. By 8 a.m. the morning after the video aired, protesters stood outside the school's wrought iron gates. Not students, parents. Some held handmade signs. Education shouldn't be built on silence. Others demanded a board meeting. Some simply screamed. The school tried to remain calm. Headmaster Wexler issued a carefully worded statement. We value the contributions of all staff and take these allegations seriously. An internal review is underway. But it wasn't enough, because the parents didn't want statements. They wanted accountability. And Earl? He remained composed. He didn't appear in more interviews. He declined several TV invitations. He told Layla he didn't want to become a talking point. Let the truth speak louder than I ever could. But behind the scenes, the Merrick family wasn't sitting still. Bradford Merrick, Austin's father, gathered his crisis PR team and went to war. He viewed the story not as a moral reckoning, but as a reputational fire to be extinguished. Make this disappear, he barked to his publicist, slamming his fist on the table. Buy out the narrative. And they tried. A smear campaign launched overnight. Anonymous Twitter accounts suddenly accused Earl of being unstable, erratic, obsessed with victimhood. Articles appeared on fringe websites, claiming he was fired from a past job for misconduct. Stories easily disproven but designed to plant doubt. Bradford paid a private investigator to dig into Earl's past. The man canvassed neighborhoods, harassed old acquaintances, and stalked Earl's apartment. Nothing illegal was found, but the goal wasn't proof. The goal was fear, and for a moment, it worked. One morning, Earl found a printed article slipped under his apartment door, a fake profile piece titled, "The Genius Who Lied, Earl Simmons' Shady Rise to Fame." His hands shook as he read it. The smear was sloppy, but it was designed to rattle him. Not ruin him, just make him question whether it was worth continuing. But Earl wasn't 20 anymore. He wasn't the young man waiting for institutions to do the right thing. He was the man who had built strength in silence. That afternoon, Layla showed up at his door, holding a flash drive in her hand. "You're gonna want to sit down," she said. He didn't. She plugged the drive into her laptop and played the file. It was footage, grainy, pulled from internal Ivy Hall security systems. In the video, Austin Merrick stood in a student lounge with 3 of his friends. They didn't know they were being recorded. They joked loudly, casually, arrogantly. Earl wasn't the only one they targeted. One student mimicked the accent of a black cafeteria worker. Another mocked a Nigerian English teacher's pronunciation. Austin laughed as he impersonated Earl mopping the floor, dragging his feet in exaggerated circles. At one point, he looked into the camera, not knowing it was on, and said, "They're here to serve, not to solve equations. That's just the natural order." The room went silent. Layla paused the video. This just got darker. Earl stared at the screen. His voice was quiet. "That's who he really is." Layla exhaled. "Who leaked this?" Earl looked up. "I didn't," he said. "But someone inside Ivy Hall just switched sides." She nodded. "Then we go again." 2 days later, the footage was online. And this time, the firestorm turned into a reckoning. Ivy Hall's black staff staged a sick-out protest. Dozens of parents pulled their children from the school. The mayor issued a public condemnation. And for the first time since the video went viral, the school board scheduled an emergency session to decide the future of not just Earl but Austin Merrick and Headmaster Wexler himself. Inside Ivy Hall, silence roared louder than ever. Then someone leaked footage from inside Ivy Hall, showing Austin mocking not just Earl, but other black staff. The leaked footage didn't just trend, it detonated. The moment the video of Austin Merrick mocking black staff went live, it ripped open something that had been festering beneath Ivy Hall's polished surface for decades. News outlets called it the Ivy Hall reckoning. Talk shows labeled it a turning point in elite education. But for the people who had walked those marble halls with their heads bowed, it was nothing new. It was just finally visible. By sunrise, a storm had formed at the school's gates. Protesters lined the entrance holding signs that cut through the air, like knives. "Prestige built on pain. You saw us clean but never heard us speak." Not just Austin, this school is complicit. Inside the school, tension hung like a blade. Faculty meetings turned into shouting matches. Parents flooded the board with furious emails. Black alumni posted anonymous testimonials online, recounting stories of being overlooked, underpromoted, disciplined disproportionately. And then came the damning thread. An anonymous former Ivy Hall cafeteria supervisor posted a 13-part expose on Twitter. "I was denied a raise 5 years in a row while training white temps who later got hired full-time. My reviews were excellent. Still didn't matter. I reported it." Silence. The thread included time-stamped emails, pay stubs, and HR documents. It went viral within an hour. Other former employees followed. A black teacher shared how her contract wasn't renewed after she reported a student drawing a noose on her whiteboard. Another revealed how a student had mocked her Caribbean accent, and nothing was done. Then a former student posted her story. "I was expelled sophomore year for distracting appearance." Translation: "I wore my hair in box braids. The dean told me my look didn't align with Ivy Hall's culture." Screenshots included. It wasn't one leak anymore. It was a flood. Ivy Hall had marketed itself for decades as a beacon of progress, the kind of place where diverse voices thrived and students were groomed for global leadership. But the reality being revealed was far more sinister, a system designed to polish privilege while quietly erasing everyone else. And at the center of the backlash, the Merrick name. Austin's face, once splashed across school promotional brochures, once used in videos about young innovation, was now digital poison. Companies scrubbed his internships. Stanford quietly pulled back his early admission. His father's legal team sent takedown notices to websites reposting the leaked video. But it was too late. Because the internet never forgets. Inside the Merrick estate, Bradford Merrick stood in front of a 90-inch screen in his private den, jaw clenched, eyes narrowed. "This school is a liability," he muttered. Across from him sat a PR strategist, pale and sweating. We've put out 5 statements, Mr. Merrick. We're doing our best to separate the family name from the school. Bradford didn't blink. Then do more. Buy out the board if you have to. Silence the story. Or make Simmons the villain. The strategist hesitated. Sir, I'm not sure we can silence Simmons anymore. He's credible. Public opinion's behind him. Bradford turned slowly. Then we'll take something from him. Meanwhile, inside Ivy Hall's faculty building, the board met behind closed doors. The windows were covered, the phones were off, and the words were anything but diplomatic. Don't be fooled, said one board member. This is not just about Earl Simmons. This is about what he represents. Which is? Another asked sharply. Disruption. The room went quiet. Behind their statements of concern, their posturing of reform, the board was terrified. Earl had cracked their illusion. The janitor was no longer just a staff member. He had become a symbol, a problem. If we let this continue, said another member, we lose control. Parents are watching. Donors are uneasy. We need to show we're handling it. A vote was held, not on how to fix the racism, but on what to do about Earl Simmons. The result? 6-3. Earl would be let go, due to breach of internal conduct standards. That was the language they chose. Sterile, bloodless, designed for legal shielding. Later that day, Earl received an email from Headmaster Wexler's assistant. We'd like to meet regarding your new role. Please report to the boardroom at 3. The subject line read, Promotion Discussion. Earl saw it and sat still. He hadn't asked for a promotion. He hadn't asked for praise. But part of him, the part that still believed dignity could be honored, allowed a small breath of hope to rise in his chest. At 2:36 p.m., he walked across the courtyard. Protesters were still gathered outside the gate. Students peered out from classroom windows. Even some teachers stood frozen in the halls as he passed, as if unsure whether to look him in the eye. He knocked once on the boardroom door. It opened slowly. Wexler stood at the head of the table, flanked by 3 board members and a school lawyer. Earl stepped inside, nodding politely. Wexler motioned to a chair. Please, Mr. Simmons. Earl sat. No one smiled. No one welcomed him. No one said the word promotion. Instead, Wexler slid a thin white envelope across the table. Earl stared at it. I don't understand, he said quietly. Wexler folded his hands. Mr. Simmons, after careful consideration, the board has decided to terminate your employment effective immediately. We appreciate your years of service. Earl didn't blink. Terminate, he repeated. One board member shifted uncomfortably. There's concern your continued presence is disrupt. To who? Earl asked. No one answered. The lawyer spoke next. There will be a severance package. We recommend you refrain from public statements moving forward. Earl leaned back in his chair. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't beg. He didn't protest. He simply stared at each of them, one by one. You want me gone because the lie's louder than your comfort, he said. Because truth doesn't look good on your brochures. Wexler cleared his throat. This isn't personal. Earl stood slowly, took the envelope and slid it back across the table. No, it's historical, he said, and it's not over. He walked to the door, paused, turned back. You didn't fire me, he said. You revealed yourselves. Then he left. But just as he exited the building, a voice called out from behind. Mr. Simmons? He turned. It was one of the senior students, Jamal, a quiet kid who worked 2 jobs and always sat in the back of assemblies. He held a printed page in his hand. You need to see this, Jamal said, eyes wide. Earl took the paper. It was a leaked email from someone inside MIT. Subject line, Earl Simmons. Suppression order discussion. The body of the email was short. He's planning to sue. If he speaks, we bury him. I'll initiate contact with Ivy Hall's board. The sender, BN Moffat, @edu. As Earl arrived for what he thought was a promotion, he was handed a termination letter instead. They called it a violation of conduct. That was the official phrase typed neatly in the termination letter Earl Simmons received after 30 years of quiet service, loyalty, and invisible labor. Violation of conduct. No details, no explanation, just a bland phrase loaded with cold implication, enough to satisfy legal protocols, but hollow enough to dodge accountability. But outside Ivy Hall's pristine gates, the world wasn't buying it. Because everyone knew the truth. Earl Simmons was fired for becoming visible. He had stepped out of the role they were comfortable seeing him in. The silent janitor, the polite man in blue, and became something dangerous, A mirror. One that reflected the racism embedded not just in one institution, but across generations of them. And in the eyes of the powerful, nothing is more threatening than a black man holding a mirror to the system that built their comfort. By the next morning, Ivy Hall's gates were no longer just an entrance. They were a line in the sand. Students began walking out in waves, first in quiet pairs, then in groups, then the entire senior class. Some wore printed shirts with Earl's face beneath the word visible. Others held signs reading, "You fired the truth." Even children of donors joined the protest, breaking rank from privilege for the first time. The faculty was split. Some whispered support in private. Others clung to silence. But a few, 3 black teachers and 1 white history professor, joined the students outside, refusing to teach another class until Earl was reinstated. News vans returned to the school lawn, headlights cutting through fog. Microphones were extended over fences. Parents gave tearful interviews. Alumni wrote op-eds. A petition hit 500,000 signatures within 72 hours. But through it all, Earl remained calm.
Not out of numbness,
but resolve. He had been erased before. He would not allow it to happen again. Not quietly, not easily, and not without a fight. That same evening, he met Layla Brooks at her Brooklyn apartment. Her walls were lined with case files, newspaper clippings, and half-sipped coffee mugs. She stood at her whiteboard, connecting names with red string. Ivy Hall Board, Benjamin Moffat, MIT Legal Counsel, Merrick Holdings. "You've got enough here to sue both institutions," she said, spinning toward Earl. "The employment discrimination alone is airtight. But the academic sabotage, that's legacy breaking." Earl nodded slowly. "You really think it's possible?" Layla looked him dead in the eye. "You want justice? We go federal." They got to work immediately. Layla helped him file a dual complaint, one against Ivy Hall for wrongful termination, racial discrimination, and retaliation. The other against MIT for academic sabotage, defamation, and unlawful expulsion, without due process. They compiled everything: the internal MIT memo, the leaked Ivy Hall footage, testimonies from former staff, even a sworn statement from Dr. Holly Bray, Earl's former advisor. She had finally come forward, her guilt eclipsed by her need to tell the truth. "I watched them destroy him," she wrote. "I stayed silent. I'm done being silent." The lawsuit was filed under federal civil rights law. It named names. It named institutions. And within hours it sent shockwaves across the country. News outlets picked it up. Activists organized. College professors tweeted that the case could redefine academic accountability in America. Law students studied the filing as part of their civil procedure modules. But behind boardroom doors, panic set in. MIT's legal team scrambled to issue statements denying wrongdoing. Ivy Hall released a new press release calling Earl's firing an unfortunate misunderstanding and offering a full independent review. But Earl rejected their offers for private settlement. He wasn't interested in silence money. He wanted the story heard. Loud. Public. Undeniable. The case was assigned to the U.S. District Court in Connecticut. The initial pretrial hearing was set for 3 weeks out. For Earl, it felt like justice was finally within reach. Until the judge was announced. Judge Roland A. Givens. A respected federal judge with a long history of conservative rulings and a reputation for siding with institutions. But more importantly, and more dangerously, Judge Givens had been a law school roommate of Bradford Merrick, the father of Austin, the architect of Earl's humiliation, the man who still held quiet power in elite circles. When Layla saw the name on the assignment, she froze. No, this is a problem." Earl leaned forward. "You sure it's that Givens?" She nodded, pulling up an old alumni database. There it was, class of '84, Yale Law. Givens and Merrick listed side by side in multiple society photos. Same fraternity, same rowing team. "They're old money close," Layla said. "This isn't just bias, it's connection." Earl exhaled sharply. He wasn't surprised. Not really, but it still stung. "So now what?" he asked. Layla paced. "We can file for recusal, but it's risky. We need proof of conflict of interest, and fast." "What if he refuses to step down?" "Then we fight anyway," she said, her voice rising. "Because you've got truth, and truth scares the hell out of people like him." The following morning, Earl sat in a cafe, his hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug. He looked out the window at people rushing past, earbuds in, unaware of the war he was walking into. Across the table, Layla reviewed the recusal motion draft. He'll push back, she warned. He'll claim impartiality. But we force the conversation. We put pressure where they can't hide. Earl nodded slowly. I didn't ask for this, he said, voice low. But maybe I was built for it. Layla looked up. Not maybe, she said. You are. By the next week, the courthouse steps were lined with supporters. College students, teachers, former janitors, retired professors, all holding signs, let him speak. Degrees don't protect racism. You can't fire truth. Inside, as Earl walked through security, reporters shouted his name. Some asked about the judge. Others asked what he hoped to achieve. He didn't stop to answer. Because in that moment, Earl Simmons wasn't just a janitor, or a genius, or even a plaintiff. He was a man walking into a system that once buried him, now prepared to force it to look him in the eye. As he entered the courtroom, Judge Givens looked up from the bench. The moment their eyes met, Earl saw it. Not recognition, not guilt, but calculation. But then a judge with ties to the Merrick family was assigned to the case, and the odds shifted dangerously. The courtroom buzzed like an electric fence. Seats were packed shoulder to shoulder. Journalists crammed into the back row with notepads, cameras, and whispered commentary. Ivy Hall students sat beside MIT alumni, their faces tight with curiosity or concern. Every inch of the room felt tense, as if justice and legacy were arm wrestling in plain sight. At the defense table sat the Merrick legal machine. 5 lawyers in tailored suits, briefcases gleaming, expressions calm but predatory. They were bred for this, paid for this, protected by every privilege Earl Simmons had never known. Earl sat alone at the plaintiff's table, with Layla Brooks beside him, dressed modestly in a navy blazer and flats. No high-end law firm, no entourage, just truth and documentation so meticulously collected, it could shake empires. Judge Roland Givens presided at the bench, gavel perched beside him like a loaded weapon. His expression was unreadable. His voice clipped, though he denied the recusal motion, citing lack of material conflict. Everyone in the room knew the undercurrent. The Merrick legacy ran through him like quiet electricity. Still, the trial moved forward, and it didn't take long for the knives to come out. The Merrick team opened with brutal precision. Their lead counsel, a gray-haired man named Sloan Ashbury, stood, adjusted his cufflinks, and launched an attack wrapped in civility. Mr. Simmons, he said, pacing, claims to be the victim of a grand conspiracy spanning 3 decades, multiple institutions, and influential figures. Yet he provides no direct evidence. He brings hearsay, emotion, assumptions. He turned toward the jury. And now, after 30 years, he resurfaces, conveniently, with documents no one else can verify. Layla objected immediately. Your Honor, the documents have verified timestamps, signatures, and metadata. That objection's already been addressed in pretrial. Givens gave a slow nod, sustained in part. Proceed, Mr. Ashbury. Carefully, Ashbury smiled, and then the smear campaign began. They called Earl unstable. They introduced medical records from years ago when he'd been treated for exhaustion and anxiety, conveniently framed as erratic behavior. They presented grainy photos of Earl attending activist meetings in the early 2000s, and spun them as radical affiliations. Layla stood and objected. Again and again. Sometimes she won. Often she didn't. Still, Earl sat steady, because he knew the truth was waiting, and it would not be silenced forever. The next day, Layla took her turn, and the tide began to turn. She brought in witnesses. First, a former Ivy Hall math teacher, a white woman who broke ranks to testify under subpoena. I was there the day Earl solved the riddle, she said. Austin mocked him. The class laughed, but Earl solved it faster than I could. That wasn't about conduct. It was about race. Then came the cafeteria supervisor. I filed 3 complaints, she said, about racial comments, about being passed over. No one did anything. But when Earl's video went viral, they cleaned house. Quietly. We were told not to talk. And then came a surprise. A student, one of Austin's old friends. He took the stand with a nervous breath and shaky hands. I was in the lounge that day. I laughed too. But Earl didn't do anything wrong. He was always respectful, always quiet. And we, his voice cracked. We treated him like he didn't exist. We made him a joke. I regret it. The jury was listening now. Even Judge Givens couldn't hide the subtle shift in posture. But nothing could prepare the room for what came next. Layla called her final witness, and anonymously referred to in filings as Witness X. The courtroom doors opened, and in walked a frail man in a wheelchair. Oxygen tube clipped beneath his nose, escorted by a nurse. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Is that? Yes, Layla said clearly. This is Dr. Leonard Grayson. Tenured MIT dean, retired, terminal cancer diagnosis. And until this week, a silent bystander. Dr. Grayson took the stand. Hands trembling, voice hoarse. He leaned into the mic. In 1993, I was part of the Academic Misconduct Board. I saw the memo. I knew what they did to Earl Simmons. Silence blanketed the courtroom. They were scared of him, he continued. He was smarter than the department chair, more innovative than the senior faculty. And when he corrected Dr. Moffat in a seminar, politely, I might add, the whispers began. I remember Moffat saying, "That boy is too arrogant for his own good." That's when the plan started. He pulled a manila folder from his lap. I kept the real draft, he said. The one they said Earl plagiarized. It's blank. There was no original. They made it up. Layla stepped forward. Why didn't you speak sooner, Dr. Grayson? He closed his eyes. Because I was a coward. But I'm dying now. And I won't carry that silence with me. It was a mic drop in the truest sense. Earl couldn't move. His throat tightened. He'd lived for decades under the weight of a lie. And now, in a single breath, it had shattered. The room exploded. Reporters rushed outside to file updates. The jury's faces had changed. Stone turned to sympathy. Doubt into fury. The truth was out. Justice, it seemed, was finally near. But then, just as Layla began her closing argument, the fire alarm rang. Loud, shrill, violent. Seconds later, security rushed in. Court is adjourned. Everyone evacuate. Now. People scrambled. The judge banged his gavel. Sirens howled outside. Bomb threat, someone whispered. Earl froze. Layla grabbed her files, her laptop, the evidence binders. They were rushed outside along with everyone else. They stood in the parking lot, breath visible in the cold. The courthouse was evacuated. Police taped off the block. Bomb squad arrived. Helicopters hovered overhead. Hours passed. When the threat was cleared and everyone returned inside, the courtroom was locked. The judge announced court would resume the following morning. But when Layla reopened her evidence case, her hands went still. What's wrong? Earl asked. She didn't answer. She just stared. The flash drive, the one containing Dr. Grayson's audio testimony, MIT documents, and internal emails, was gone. Not misplaced. Gone. She looked around, panic rising. No, I had it zipped. It was right here. I packed it myself. They searched her bag, her backup drive, her encrypted USB. All gone. Layla's voice was shaking now. It was organized. Someone used the chaos. Earl didn't blink. He'd seen this before. Not with bombs, not with courtrooms, but with lies that erased people before they could be heard. It wasn't just about money now. It was about legacy, power, control. They weren't going to lose quietly. But just before the verdict, a bomb threat cleared the court, and evidence from Earl's case mysteriously disappeared. The courtroom had never felt colder. Earl stood in the corner of the hallway just outside the courtroom doors, staring at Layla as she tore through her briefcase, her brow furrowed, hands trembling. Dozens of pages were still there, printed witness statements, email printouts, even a hard copy of Earl's thesis. But the digital core, the beating heart of their case, the flash drive containing the recorded testimony, encrypted files, original timestamps, and metadata, gone. Completely gone. No, Layla muttered, turning her backpack inside out. I packed it myself. Earl didn't speak. His shoulders stiffened, his mouth drawn tight. He didn't need confirmation. He already knew. This wasn't panic. It was sabotage. Again, a federal marshal approached with a clipboard and a blank expression. The building's clear, he said flatly. We're resuming in 30. Layla looked up from the ground, eyes wide. You don't understand. Someone used the bomb threat to break into my case. The marshal raised an eyebrow. That's a serious accusation. So is erasing 30 years of proof, she snapped. He looked away. Earl put a hand on her shoulder. We're not done, he said quietly. We've come back from worse. But inside he felt the old weight returning, the one he'd carried since 1993, when the system didn't just reject him, it rewrote his story and locked the door behind him. This time he had the world watching. And now, someone had risked public terror to erase him again. 30 minutes later, court resumed. Judge Givens was visibly irritated. "Miss Brooks," he said, tapping his pen. "Do you wish to proceed or request a continuance?" Layla stood slowly. "We're requesting a continuance, Your Honor. Core digital evidence is missing from our case materials. It was here prior to the evacuation." Givens frowned. "Are you alleging theft?" "I'm alleging tampering, with intent." There was a pause. Givens glanced over his glasses. "Your accusations carry weight, but unless you present security footage or eyewitness testimony, this court cannot stall based on speculation." He banged the gavel. "Motion denied. Proceed." Earl inhaled sharply but said nothing. The trial pushed on. Layla pivoted as best she could, focusing on printed records and sworn testimony. But the blow was real, and both sides knew it. The Merrick legal team smirked through the proceedings, whispering between themselves like men watching a fire they'd secretly set. And then, just when it seemed everything was unraveling, Layla's phone buzzed. She checked it discreetly. Her eyes narrowed. "Earl," she whispered, "you need to see this." They waited until the court recessed for lunch. Outside, under the shelter of a nearby alley, Layla pulled out her phone and opened an encrypted chat app. "Someone from inside Merrick Tech just leaked this," she said. "They're calling themselves Shadowwire. I verified the email domain. It's real." Earl squinted at the phone screen. It was a screenshot. A Slack channel labeled "On Crisis Response Team. Internal to Merrick Tech." The messages were clear. "Brooks Drive can't make it to closing. Givens won't stop the trial. Just distract long enough. Uniforms ready. Court janitor team. Already rotated. No security overlap if we time it right." Earl felt his chest tighten. They hadn't just stolen evidence. They'd impersonated him. On screen was a second attachment, a security photo from the courthouse hallway. It was grainy, low-res, but damning. A man in a Navy janitor uniform, identical to Earl's old Ivy Hall attire, wheeling a cart past the court record room. Badge turned inward, face obscured. "Same build," Layla whispered. "They wanted people to think it was you." Earl stared at the image. "They've done this before," he said bitterly. "Only difference now is, they got caught." They filed an emergency motion immediately. Judge Givens, to no one's surprise, tried to suppress it. "This is unverifiable," he said. "Unvetted sources. No chain of custody." But this time, the press got ahead of him. Layla leaked the screenshot. By sunset, it was everywhere. Shadowwire trended on Twitter. Whistleblower subreddits broke it down, frame by frame. Independent journalists cross-verified the Slack logs. A former Merrick Tech contractor confirmed that one of the usernames in the chat matched a current executive assistant to Bradford Merrick. The damage was irreversible, and the pressure was insurmountable. 3 days later, in a closed-door session, Judge Givens recused himself. The motion cited concerns regarding public confidence and perceived bias. But the truth was clear. He'd been exposed. His legacy and ties to the Merrick family were now a liability, not an asset. A new judge was sworn in, and with it a new jury, this time randomly selected from a broader district pool, not the Ivy Hall-lined circle originally drawn. The courtroom tone shifted instantly. The new judge, a black woman named Judge Celeste Irons, opened proceedings with no pleasantries. "We are not here to discuss personalities," she said. "We are here to uncover patterns. Patterns of power, suppression, and what happens when silence is used as currency." Layla smiled for the first time in days. Earl exhaled. Not relief, but momentum. And just as the courtroom prepared to resume, an email pinged into Layla's inbox. From President at Subject, Emergency Press Conference, MIT Public Apology. Earl's heart paused. He looked at Layla. She opened the email, scanned it fast. "They're going public," she said. "They're going to admit it." He blinked. "What?" She turned the screen toward him. There, in bold, President Karen Miles will issue a formal statement regarding the wrongful expulsion of Earl Simmons and the systemic failures of the Institute in 1993. The conference will be streamed live at noon. It was real, not a rumor, not a hope, a reckoning. Earl sat in the hallway outside the courtroom and stared at his reflection in the marble floor tiles. He saw the janitor they once reduced him to, the student they once erased, and the man he had become, defiant, determined, and now, undeniable. Behind him, the courthouse doors opened. "Mr. Simmons?" a clerk called. He turned. The court will reconvene in 5. Earl stood, buttoned his coat, and took one last breath before stepping back into the room that once tried to bury him. Only this time, he wasn't the one on trial. The judge was forced to recuse himself, and a new jury was sworn in, just as MIT's president announced an emergency press conference. The auditorium was silent as the podium mic crackled to life. Bright white lights washed over the mahogany stage at MIT's historic Kresge Auditorium, where hundreds of faculty, alumni, and press had gathered, not to celebrate a breakthrough, but to witness a reckoning. Cameras lined the aisles, reporters whispered into live feeds, students held signs near the balcony, "Justice for Earl Simmons, knowledge shouldn't be color-coded," and "erase the stain, not the man." President Karen Miles stepped to the podium, her navy suit crisp, her jaw tight with the weight of institutional guilt. She placed both hands on either side of the podium and stared out into the audience and the millions watching the live stream around the world. "We failed him," she began, her voice raw. 32 years ago, a brilliant student named Earl Simmons walked these halls ahead of his time, ahead of his peers, and tragically, unprotected by the system, meant to empower him. The silence deepened. Miles continued. In 1993, Mr. Simmons was wrongfully accused of academic misconduct, without due process, without transparency, and, as we now know, without merit. Our institution prioritized reputation over righteousness. Today, we publicly and unequivocally apologize. There was no clapping. Not yet. The audience was still frozen in disbelief. The records of his expulsion have been expunged, she added. His academic achievements fully reinstated, and today the Massachusetts Institute of Technology formally offers Earl Simmons an honorary doctorate in recognition of his contributions to science, his resilience in the face of injustice, and his example to all who believe education must be just, to be meaningful. That's when the doors at the back of the auditorium opened, and Earl walked in, not flanked by security or PR teams, not escorted by handlers or aides, just Earl in a charcoal suit, no tie, his steps steady and calm as the crowd turned toward him. Camera shutters fired. The room stood in a wave of respect as he approached the stage. President Miles stepped aside, nodding solemnly. The applause was thunderous now, not the kind offered out of ceremony, but the kind born from collective regret and admiration. Earl stood at the microphone, hands resting lightly on the wood. He let the silence return before he spoke. "I appreciate the gesture," he said quietly. "I appreciate the words." He looked directly at President Miles. "But I don't need your degree." Gasps rippled across the room. "I needed your respect 30 years ago." Now the silence was thunderous. He didn't yell. He didn't scold. He simply said the thing too many institutions feared to face. That restitution without accountability is just rebranding. That apologies without consequence are hollow. "I was 20 when I stood in front of a review board that wouldn't even look me in the eye," he said, voice steady. "I was told I was a thief. Not of property, but of ideas. And the people who knew the truth let it happen because protecting the system was easier than protecting a student who didn't look like the ones in their legacy portraits." A slow, mournful applause began to build. Not celebratory, but reverent. "I spent 3 decades cleaning other people's messes while the people who made mine got tenure and wealth and silence. So no, I don't need your honorary doctorate." He took a breath. "But I accept your apology, because there's power in truth, even when it comes late." The crowd rose to their feet again, louder this time. President Miles wiped away a tear. Outside, media vans broadcasted his words live to the world. TikTok was flooded with clips within minutes. Activists reposted his speech. Students across campuses quoted him on chalkboards and whiteboards. The hashtag #IamEarl trended globally within the hour. But while MIT was facing its past, Ivy Hall was unraveling in real time. The lawsuits began just 2 days after Earl's reinstatement. A coalition of former Ivy Hall employees filed a class action suit alleging decades of racial discrimination, retaliation, and deliberate suppression of black staff advancement. The evidence gathered through Earl's case, combined with newly leaked documents from internal HR meetings, exposed a pattern of systemic bias that reached all the way to the boardroom. The headmaster, Charles Wexler, resigned under pressure. The school board issued a public statement promising restructuring and racial equity audits. Federal investigators from the Department of Education arrived the following week to assess Title VI violations. Ivy Hall's once unshakable reputation was now a national embarrassment. And then came the final blow. Stanford University issued a formal letter revoking Austin Merrick's provisional admission, citing serious concerns regarding character, academic integrity, and conduct unbecoming of a future leader. Austin's carefully curated social media accounts went dark. So did his father's company. Merrick Tech's stock dropped 17% in 3 days after activist investors demanded an independent inquiry into the company's role in the Earl Simmons sabotage. Emails leaked by the same whistleblower who exposed the courtroom sabotage showed Bradford Merrick authorizing illegal surveillance, hush money offers, and blackmail strategies. One board member publicly resigned in protest. The company's board froze Bradford's decision-making power. The family name that once opened every door now echoed like a curse in every headline. But Earl wasn't watching the fall. He was building the future. Layla sat across from him in a small cafe in Harlem, smiling as she slid over a folder. "You ready for this?" she asked. Earl opened it slowly. Inside was a blueprint. Not for a legal strategy. Not for another lawsuit. But for something bigger. At the top of the page, in bold font, was a name. The Simmons Institute for Math and Equity.
A new kind of school.
One that didn't sort students by pedigree or proximity to power, but by curiosity, potential, and brilliance, especially those who'd been overlooked. It would offer free STEM education to underserved youth, run workshops in formerly redlined communities, fund scholarships for first-generation college students, and perhaps most radically, it would be designed by the very people elite systems once pushed out. "Locations locked," Layla said. "We got 6 major donors, 4 faculty applicants, and the city's backing us for the building permit." Earl didn't say anything for a moment. He just stared at the sketch on the final page. The front of the institute, modeled after MIT's dome, but inscribed with 5 words above the entrance. "No voice will be erased." He smiled, finally, but before he could speak, Layla's phone buzzed. She checked the screen and frowned. "It's from the Merrick estate," she said cautiously. "Legal inquiry." Earl raised an eyebrow. "Another threat?" "No," she said slowly, scanning the email. "It's Aust." That caught his attention. "What does he want?" Layla read aloud, her voice low and unsure. "I know I can't undo the harm, but I want to help. I want to learn. I want to earn back something. Please, if you'll let me, I want to be part of the Simmons Institute. Even if it's just sweeping the floors." Earl said nothing. His face gave nothing away, but his fingers slowly tapped the table, thoughtful, measured, not out of indecision, out of the weight of legacy. Because while the world had watched him fight for justice, only Earl knew what came next. And it wasn't revenge. It was something far more dangerous to systems built on exclusion. A second chance given on his terms. But Earl had one final card left to play. A legacy that the morning sunlight fell softly on the glass facade of the Simmons Institute. The building was new, not ostentatious, but quietly elegant. Clean lines, large windows, and a carved inscription over the entrance that read, "No voice will be erased." On that opening day, the air felt electric. Students, many of them young black boys and girls from neighborhoods long ignored by elite academies, lined up outside. Some came with backpacks patched and worn, others in hand-me-down shoes. But none of them felt invisible anymore. At the front of the line stood a security guard, and behind him stood volunteers handing out welcome packets. Earl Simmons arrived early, wearing a charcoal blazer and light blue shirt open at the collar. His sleeves rolled up just slightly, as if to suggest he was ready to work, not just lead. He didn't pause to admire the building. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the lobby filled with hopeful faces. He greeted a few students by name, though he didn't remember all of them yet. He could see their potential. He felt their weight of expectations. He felt his own. As the doors opened and the first students filed in, Earl addressed the gathered families in the auditorium. The stage lights were modest. The chairs sat on risers, but the resonance of his voice carried. "Welcome," he said. "This is the first day of something new. Not just for you, for all of us. We are here because for too long, talented minds were ignored. Because of their zip code, their hair, their last name. That ends today." His words were calm but fierce. He did not shout. He didn't need to. The faces in the audience reflected the gravity of the moment. Proud parents, siblings looking wide-eyed, and students who for the first time believed someone saw them. Donations had poured in faster than the staff could track. Tech companies who once ignored black talent were now hosting gala dinners to raise money for the Simmons Institute. Alumni of MIT and Ivy Hall, some of them embarrassed, some inspired, made quiet visits. They offered resources, mentoring programs, and scholarships. It was ironic the institution that once deemed Earl invisible now begged to help him build a future for others. But Earl accepted on his terms. He met with each major donor not in a velvet office but in the labs and classrooms he had built. He asked, "How many of your scholarships go to kids whose social media shows stat-based internships, not poverty and grit?" He insisted that money come with accountability, that the institute would not replicate the old gatekeeping dressed up in new suits. His leadership team, new mostly, included educators who had been ignored by other schools, a black physics professor who had taught at community college for 15 years and never been tenured, a Latina software engineer who mentored girls of color in her spare time without pay, a former janitor from a public school who now ran the student services program. They formed a culture of visibility, respect, and radical expectation. You are talented, you will be seen, and we will work until you are celebrated. Yet even on this triumphant day, Earl felt a quiet tension. He knew how institutions could bend under public pressure, and then snap back once the cameras left. He watched as volunteer sign-in sheets accumulated and noticed faint hesitations. A donor who offered funds but asked for quiet involvement. A board member who complimented the building but never asked about the students. He knew this fight wasn't over. Systems ran deep, bias didn't vanish with press releases. He also knew the unusual sight waiting at the final moment of the welcome ceremony might shift everything. When the auditorium doors opened again just as he concluded his remarks, a tall young man in a tailored blazer walked up the aisle. His face was familiar, gilded blonde hair, a posture of privilege, but with something unreadable in his expression. When Earl's eyes met his, the young man nodded curtly, then moved to the registration table ahead of schedule. A murmur went through the audience. Austin Merrick. The twist stung. Austin had once mocked Earl's brilliance, orchestrated his humiliation, and leveraged the dynamics of class and race as weaponized performance. Now he was standing quietly in line, holding an application form. Earl paused mid-breath, looking away so the audience wouldn't see the flicker of old anger. He looked back. Austin did not speak. He didn't shout apologies. He simply held the form, his posture humble but his eyes locked on Earl. The crowd noticed. Some parents shifted uncomfortably. The volunteers whispered. A few students looked confused. There was no announcement. Earl cleared his throat and continued the ceremony, scanning the room without acknowledging the form directly. He knew the significance. This moment had been orchestrated for cameras, or maybe for confrontation, or maybe for redemption. He didn't know yet, but he recognized it as something dangerous and critical. Later in his office, Earl met with his administrative director, Camille Rhodes, a former sociology professor who had once been passed over for promotion because her research focused on race in elite institutions. She sat behind her desk, and when Earl re-entered, she gestured at the file with Austin's name. "I saw him at the line," she said carefully. Her voice was low. "He wants a position here." Earl raised an eyebrow. "Or admission?" She nodded. "Yes," feeling as he applied for student admission. But he also asked to volunteer for a mentoring role. Earl closed his eyes for a moment. He recalled the boardroom, the chalkboard, the riddle, the laughter. He recalled Austin's smug voice, asking, "Bet you can't solve this, janitor." He recalled the camera phones, the viral video, the humiliation, and now this. Camille watched him. "We can choose to reject him, or accept him. But if we accept him, he becomes part of the Institute's story, not as a condescension, but maybe as transformation." Earl didn't speak. He looked out the window at the students scattered on the new lawn. Some played AM radio in the shade. Others tinkered with robotics kits. He thought of them, and he thought of what the Institute stood for. A future built on justice, not pity. "Invite him in," Earl said quietly. Camille blinked. "What?" "I'm willing to give this institution, this school, an example of what inclusion must look like." "Yes. Invite him. But on our terms." Camille exhaled. "And if he just wants redemption for himself, then he'll earn it," Earl answered. "Same as everyone else." The next week, the Simmons Institute formally announced its first class, 50 students from historically underserved communities across the country. The media covered it under banners of redefining elite education. Earl gave interviews not to boast, but to highlight the student. He pointed the camera to 19-year-old Amira Jackson from Detroit, who coded a weather prediction model in her bedroom, to 14-year-old Malik Rivera from Miami, who built a prosthetic hand for his little sister. Donors were visible, but students were the story. Yet even as they celebrated, Earl's internal radar buzzed. He received an unexpected email. Board meeting postponed. Deferred compliance review. The board members were rich and polite, but in the margins, he could see the same hesitation that once cost him his career. They wanted change, but maybe not this much. They wanted legacy without discomfort. The real test came a few days later, during a mentor meet event, where students rotated through tables with professionals and volunteers. Earl walked between tables. At one table he paused to listen to a black female engineer from Goldman Sachs reassure a student that she had once been told her hair made her too bold. At another, a Latino math professor encouraged students to publish papers before graduating high school. The energy was tangible. Then he saw Austin. At the table adjacent to the robotics club, Austin stood with a volunteer badge, clipboard in hand, listening to a student ask about how to get into Stanford. Austin offered advice, shyly. He said things like, "Maybe you should focus on what you love, not just the school." It wasn't scripted, but it felt disciplined. And sincere? Earl wasn't sure yet, but he realized something important. Austin was here, on his terms. The opening day celebration ended with hat tosses, white hats with the Institute's emblem into the air. Cheer filled the room. Families hugged, cameras clicked, students posed for photos. Earl stood back, quietly proud. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't claim the moment. He let it happen around him. After, he walked to the rooftop garden. The building overlooked the city skyline, the setting sun igniting windows across blocks. He stood alone, leaning on the railing, reflecting on the journey from a janitor's mop to a founder's vision. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Austin. "Thank you for today. I'd like to stay. Let me know how I can help." Earl stared at the screen. He thought of the boardroom laughter, the riddle, the daily invisibility, the viral video, the courtroom, the apology. He thought of the students who would rely on this institute, and the legacy he was building not for himself, but for them. Then he smiled. Not because he trusted Austin yet, but because this school would test him, test them all, would force truth into structure, justice into curriculum, inclusion into design. And as he looked out toward the skyline, he realized the final chapter hadn't been written yet. On opening day, someone unexpected stood in line for admission. Austin Merrick. The morning air at the campus of the Simmons Institute felt crisp, full of possibility and promise. A bright autumn sun shone through tall windows, illuminating the newly planted trees and the faces of young students lined up for orientation day. Laughter, nervous excitement, backpacks, dreams. For Earl Simmons, this moment felt heavy with more than celebration. It carried the weight of decades of silence, exclusion, and finally, reclaiming. But he paused before moving forward. At the entrance of the registration hall, Earl scanned the line. Rows of bright-eyed students from under-resourced neighborhoods, often first in their families to attend high school with advanced STEM curriculum, stood proud. Many had traveled miles. Some came with parents who never believed this kind of opportunity existed. Others were quiet, wide-eyed, clutching notebooks like lifelines. Each face reminded Earl of the years he walked unnoticed. Mop in hand, brilliance ignored. He felt their energy vibrating around him. Hope, tension, longing. Then he saw him. Near the end of the line stood Austin Merrick. The same blonde hair, the same sharp blazer, but now softened in expression. Eyes downcast. He held a slim folder and a standard application packet. The irony wasn't lost on Earl, the boy who had orchestrated the public challenge. "That you can't solve this, janitor," stood now not as spectator, but as applicant. The same boy whose smug voice once echoed through the lecture hall had quietly joined the queue of those seeking his institution's admission. Austin didn't look up when Earl met his gaze. When Earl approached, Austin stepped forward. "Mr. Simmons," he began, voice low. I know I wronged you. I want to change. I want to be here, as a student. To learn through this, prove I'm more than I was." The words hung in the crisp air. Volunteers stopped. Parents glanced over. Students whispered. Austin's plea was real. Yet, Earl felt the presence of 100 stories behind the moment. Students denied. Talents buried, voices muted. The promise of the Institute was not just to lift up the forgotten, but to reject the systems that had hidden them. To accept those who believed themselves entitled would risk repeating the old narrative. Earl looked at Austin carefully. Not with anger, not with panic, with clarity, with memory, with vision. I appreciate your honesty, Earl said quietly. But we're full for this class. His voice did not rise, but it carried weight. Volunteers nodded behind him, folding papers, scanning names. I'm sure the public school down the road will be happy to take you. A collective hush fell. Austin's lips parted. His eyes flicked upward toward the entrance sign of the Institute. He swallowed. But, I want in. I know I've got to earn it. Anything you ask. Earl held steady. We built this for students who were never given a first chance, let alone a second. This line here, he swept his arm to the waiting youth, is the purpose of this place, not to rescue you, to invite you, but you weren't excluded for accidental reasons. You had every chance. You made a choice. Austin's folder dropped from his hand. He bent quickly to pick it up. The small crowd shifted, parents whispering. Some students glared. Some looked confused. Earl felt the eyes of those behind him burning in solidarity, as if expecting justice not just in law, but in action. He turned to them. To them, he said, this is not just a classroom. It is redemption. It is claim. Not because the world told us we deserved it, but because we made it ourselves. Austin didn't defend himself. He didn't argue. He simply nodded, silent. Then he turned and began walking away. Out of line, out of frame, out of ceremony. No one followed. The room didn't erupt in applause. It was a moment of recognition, not spectacle. Earl watched him go. The man he once derided was no longer cartoon villain. He was just a man seeking entry. But the Institute hadn't been created for that kind of redemption. At least not yet. The volunteers resumed their work. The students filed in. The speeches resumed. Parents applauded. Cameras clicked. Earl stepped off stage, later, and mingled with students. He knelt at one table, where a 14-year-old girl named Tasha, from Birmingham, showed her robotics project. He raised his hand to the sky with 12-year-old Malik, from Miami, discovering vectors for the first time. He listened to their dreams. He didn't speak about himself, but inside his mind, something stirred. He thought of his past. MIT, the accusation, the years of cleaning floors, the viral video, but also the change, the interview, the apology, the lawsuits. It all led here, and here led somewhere else. That evening, after the orientation pudding dessert round, he retreated to his office. The city lights blinked beyond his window. He sat at his desk, looked at the photo of his 21-year-old self in his lab coat and the framed charter of the Simmons Institute. He rubbed his temples. Camille knocked and entered quietly. Earl, she said softly, we had another call, from the board. He looked up. They want a meeting tomorrow. Early. Earl nodded. And there's something else, she continued. The application from Mr. Merrick came through as student ID Shanfiro45. But we found a second form, same name, student ID Shanfiro46, flagged for mentoring volunteer. He paused. You mean he applied twice? Earl asked. Camille nodded. Yes. And the mentor role was submitted before the student application. The twist cut through silence. Earl felt the chill of uncertainty. Why volunteer first? Why apply as student second? What was Austin really seeking? Camille went on. Also, we found that the folder he dropped, his transcript wasn't public. He listed internships. We found no one at those internships. The references didn't check out. It's thin but weird for someone in his position. Earl swallowed. So he's trying to get in, or he's trying something else. Camille leaned in. We just thought you should know. For tomorrow. Earl closed his eyes briefly. The day had unfolded brilliantly. The Institute stood tall, dozens of students buzzing with new possibilities. But the moment with Austin felt like a marker, not closure but open question. In the morning, he arrived at the board meeting. The conference room overlooked the quad, the students already gathering outside. The board members sat in semicircle, some donor families present, some educators, the legal counsel from day one. Earl took his seat at the head. Camille stood and addressed the group. We reviewed the Merrick application. We found discrepancies in the volunteer and student submissions. One member frowned. Are we rejecting him? Camille turned to Earl. He nodded. Given our mission and the message we sent today, yes, we must not undermine it by accepting someone who uses leverage to bypass what our students endured. There was nodding, murmurs of approval, but one figure remained silent. Austin Merrick. He entered quietly, walking past the board, wearing the same blazer from the registration line. He held 2 sheets of paper. He didn't smile. He didn't demand. He simply stood at the back. Earl watched him calmly. When the board chair asked if Austin wished to address them, he stepped forward. "I'm sorry for how I began this," he said, voice low. "I know it doesn't work like that anymore. I'm here. I am not here because of my name. I'm here because I want to help. If you'll let me." There was silence. Earl stood. His eyes locked with Austin's. "This institution is not your PR campaign. It is not your guilt token. It is not your stepping stone." Austin's head bowed. "If we accept you, you will be held to the same standards we apply to these students. Not a winner's circle. A learner's path. You will not be special. You will be equal." Austin looked up. "I understand." Earl turned to the board. "Gentlemen and ladies, if you approve, I will regret nothing today. But if you do not, I will regret nothing either." The room sat in tension. Then Camille called the motion. "All those in favor of accepting Mr. Merrick as a student and volunteer, please raise your hand." One hand went up. Then a second. Then the third. Earl watched as 4 hands remained down. The motion failed. Austin nodded and stepped back. He turned and walked toward the door, but then paused. He stopped, and he turned his gaze to the students waiting outside. "One day," he called softly to them, "I will be one of you." He left. The room exhaled. Earl sat quietly, letting it all settle in. He realized that justice had not meant bringing Austin in. Justice meant walking away from him. Walking away from the system that enabled people like Austin. Walking towards something bigger. Towards students whose dreams were real, whose chance was now. Earl rose. He walked to the large window overlooking the quad, where the new students were playing. Their laughter, their eager voices, reached him even with the glass in distance. He whispered, "We're just getting started." Outside, the line reshuffled. A few students whispered among themselves about the board meeting and the application they'd overheard. Some looked curious, some proud, some wondered what it meant for them. And Earl realized that this moment, the decision, the refusal, the clarity, was not an ending. It was a beginning. The institution stood, the students watched, the world waited. And just as the story ended for Earl, a new one began for every student walking through his doors. No one should have to hide their brilliance just to survive racism. Earl's story isn't rare, it's just the one that finally got seen. If you believe stolen futures deserve to be reclaimed, type yes if you believe in justice.